Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast. So now we are covering 10 of the better Asian horror films from 2002 tonight. Now as I mentioned in my last video, there are at least 4 films from this year that are referenced quite a bit when people discuss their favorite Asian horror films of all time. So we will discuss those as well as a handful of other interesting titles. We're not discussing a large number of films tonight, but there's a lot of stuff to get through, primarily because some of them are anthologies and have multiple stories within them. So let's get moving here. And as always, titles for all of the movies that I discuss are listed in the description box below. So our first film tonight is called Alter Ego, a School Conjuring, a Japanese horror comedy. Now set in an urban Japanese city, 3 young, aspiring models are on their very first fashion shoot at an abandoned and neglected school one hot summer day. Without warning, strange events begin occurring around the set that causes the models and photo crew to actually question their sanity, as one by one they begin dying in agonizing and painful ways. Now this sounds like a typical slasher film, but while watching this, I noticed that it is a bit different in terms of who or what is behind these murders. The most memorable aspects of this film are twofold. So number one, there are shots of bloodless, mangled corpses that are shaped in very odd ways. And 2, CGI face deformities. Now we have seen facial deformities before in films such as Ring-U, but the mangled corpse angle is very different, and I really liked it. It added something a little bit different here. Gave this film a little bit of its own flair. With that said, though, this is not a particularly scary film, but it does have a light, almost cheesy spookiness about it that yields some funny, bizarre WTF moments. Sometimes a film like that really hits the spot, I think. Now, the entire film actually takes place in the daytime, which is fairly uncommon for horror films, and the 63-minute runtime is pretty easy to sit through. Takashi Shimizu acted as supervising director for this flick, so he probably had some influence on set, but don't go in expecting his signature style. This is a moderately fun popcorn flick that I enjoyed. It's a pretty good flick. Now the availability of this one is that it is widely available on DVD. Alright, so our next film here is called Inner Senses, a Hong Kong horror film. Now, in attempting to cure an apparently unstable woman who claims to see ghosts, a rationalist begins to experience the very same phenomena. Now, this rationalist, who is a psychiatrist, does not believe in the supernatural and is convinced that the woman's visions are past events that she is suppressing in her mind. Now this film, just like the last one we covered, is not particularly scary, but it is driven by character development and does have some interesting ghost scenes, especially during the final 10 minutes. So I think the entertainment value kind of overpowers the lack of scariness, I should say. So this film, not every film needs to be scary. Some films can be, they can offer other things for entertainment value. It helps us to not always judge every single film by the same criteria, right? If you had a list of check boxes to check off for every film, it would just get boring if every film was structured the same way. So even for horror films, if it's not scary, that does not necessarily mean that it's not entertaining, as we certainly found out during the 80s, at least during all those, while we were covering all those crazy Hong Kong sorcery films. So just a little opinion piece there. Now, there is a love story angle in this one that may or may not work for some viewers, but I thought it was pretty good. Now, the lead actress is Carina Lam, who I really like. She's given some very good performances in other non-horror films, such as July Rhapsody, The Floating Landscape, Claustrophobia, and Lover's Discourse. And she was also in another very good horror film, actually one that's better than this one, better than Inner Senses, that we will cover when we reach 2004. She's also very good in Inner Senses. I liked her performance. It's not often where Carina Lam gives a bad performance, so she's pretty reliable. Now, the lead actor is a man named Leslie Chung, who is one of the most popular Chinese language entertainers of all time, actually, especially if you include his music. Now, personally, I find his acting performances to be a bit hit or miss, and I do believe that some of his movies are very overrated. But I do think that he was very good in Inner Senses. So both your lead actors here give good performances. Now, there is one unfortunate real-life event, actually, and that's that Leslie Chung committed suicide in 2003 by jumping off the 24th floor of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Hong Kong. And there's a reason why I mention this. Now, during my video review of Unborn But Forgotten, I had mentioned that there was a disturbing scene in the DVD special features involving Yunju Lee, who committed suicide in 2005. Now, in a similar fashion, the end of Inner Senses, the actual film itself, it has kind of a particularly sad and hard to watch scene that mirrors the circumstances in which Leslie Chung later committed suicide in real life. So I find it kind of odd that two Asian horror films, both released in 2002, had these odd foreshadowings of real life deaths. So it's something I had to note here because it's so notable. But regardless of real life events, I do think that Inner Senses is a pretty good film and I recommend it. Now, availability for this one is that it is moderately available on DVD, mostly used, but you might be able to find a new copy floating around. Now, the next film here is another Hong Kong horror film, and that is Haunted Office. Now, employees within an office building attempt to survive ghostly encounters. One of them is shadowed by a white-haired entity. One of them suspects that some of the employees are actually spirits, and another one is being terrorized by a bathroom demon. So the characters here are somewhat weak, but the script is actually quite clever at times, and it uses it uses a multi-tiered storytelling structure that is similar in ways to an anthology. And there's also a cool theme of replacement that's introduced that I will let you discover for yourself. Now, there are no Japanese-style onryo ghosts present, just in case you want to avoid those. I guess it does stretch credibility a bit that everyone would continue to work in such an office under these circumstances. But sometimes a paycheck is motivation enough, especially in today's economy, right? So the cast here is actually pretty loaded with popular Hong Kong actors who hit a lot of their peaks during the early 2000s. You got Karen Mok, who's I'm a big fan of, Shu Qi, of course, Stephen Fung, and Jordan Chan. And seeing all those people in the same horror flick is definitely a treat if you're a fan of the industry during this time period. And it is a nice diversion from the horror comedies that some of these actors are associated with, because this movie, Haunted Office, actually focuses more on establishing an eerie mood and creating, or I should say, avoiding comedy for the most part. So, you know, if you're kind of tired of those Hong Kong horror comedies that we've been covering, you know, this is one that's a little bit more serious, and it's a good one. Nice little film. Now, availability for Haunted Office is that it is actually widely available on DVD. All right, next one is a big one because there's a lot to cover regarding it. It's an anthology, and that is Kadokawa Mystery and Horror Tales, Japanese horror anthology. Now, this is a 3-part anthology of horror tales with a total of 9 short stories in all. So you have 3 different DVDs with 3 stories each, and each story's about 30 minutes each, give or take. That's a pretty big time investment for a fan of cinema, so hopefully my brief review here can steer you in the right direction. So let's start with DVD 1, or as I call it, Part 1, of Kadokawa Mystery and Horror Tales. Now, the first short story in this one is called Mainichi, and it's a pretty interesting story about a woman who helps her sister cope with the death of her boyfriend. Now, the sister here is definitely shaken up quite a bit, and it appears to be, she appears to be in like a spaced out type of mental state much of the time. Now, I do like some of the stylistic choices during the horror sequences, like the use of lighting and color. That's always important for me. Story's good too, so I recommend this one. The second story is called A Cruel Kidnapping, and it's about a salaryman who must drum up a large sum of money when his baby is kidnapped. Now, this tries to infuse a lot of humor, almost unexpectedly, I think, and it does not work quite well. It is not a good humor infusement here. There's no horror content in this one at all, almost. I mean, it's not a problem per se, but this is mostly a comedy with a very tiny amount of horror. Kind of confuses me why they included this in this series, but hey, it's not very good though. I did not like this one. The next one is Desire to Kill, third story, and that's about a mother who comes face to face with a murderer in her home. Now, she's basically determined to protect her child, as anyone would be, and she makes a desperate attempt to convince the man to leave. Now, a movie like this with this structure is heavily dependent on the interaction between the two characters, but it's really just basic stuff, and it's lacking in well-crafted suspense. So this is mostly boring stuff with a very ineffective score. So DVD 1, you got one good short film and two not so good ones. So not a good start to this Kadokawa mystery and horror series from Japan here, but things will improve. And that's where we get to DVD number 2. Again, 3 short films in this one. The first film is called Wooden Clogs, and it's about a distraught man who goes to a temple to reconnect with a relative, but instead encounters a beautiful young woman. Now, this is a pretty good romance film, supernatural kind of romance horror film that co-stars Chiaki Kuriyama, who of course we've covered a handful of times already. It is deliberately paced and only has some light horror elements, but it has good acting and lots of pleasant interaction between the leads. This is probably the most emotionally affecting entry within the entire Kadokawa film set here. I recommend this one. It's a good flick. The next one is called Regeneration, and this is about a man who undergoes treatment for alcoholism and meets an intoxicating young girl with a bizarre secret. Now, this is a weird but enjoyable love story that has some bite to it. The horror elements are ramped up a bit in this one. It's also a bit on the sultry and perverted side, which is nice, and there are a few uncomfortable moments along the way. Probably the most horrific and macabre of this Kadokawa film set. I would not be surprised if this was partially inspired by the Tomie films, because you get a little bit of that flavor, a little bit of that Tomie flavor in this one, and you'll see what that is when you watch it. So I like this one too. The last short film in this DVD number 2 is called The Last Day as a Teenager. It's about a teenager who makes a pact with the god of death, who subsequently returns to collect on a promise. So this one has more cheesiness to it, because the god of death is in the form of a 5-year-old girl, which is she's not portrayed very creepy. She's kind of goofy, but this is still pretty good. I like the ending in particular. So DVD set number 2 is a big improvement over the first DVD in this Kadokawa set. Now we move to the third and final DVD. Again, 3 more short films. We have Ghost House, which plot goes something like this. So after his daughter deals with a painful breakup with her boyfriend, she dies in a traffic accident. Now the father visits her abandoned home and encounters the spirit of his daughter in an effort to apologize to her. This one is a little bit on the monotonous side, but it does have some creepy moments and is pretty good overall. So this one's decent. It's pretty good. The next story is called The Whisper Tree. A writer is sent to investigate a strange tree. He remains unconvinced that it possesses mystical powers until unthinkable things begin to occur that are connected to a woman from his past. So this one has a good dramatic impact to it. Definitely an improvement over Ghost House, I think. And you do really feel sorry for the female lead in this one. So it gives a little bit of a dramatic impact to it. So I liked it. And then finally, we have World of Infinity. A married and unemployed man wanders aimlessly and meets a woman whose brooding personality lures him into a world of trysts and deceit. So this one is, again, pretty good in a dramatic sense. There are a few good horror scenes in this one as well. And the interesting thing here is that the protagonist continues to lose his hold of reality along the way. So he becomes more and more confused as to what experiences are real and not real. So it's a pretty interesting entry. So overall, this Kadokawa mystery and horror tale set, you got a mixed bag, really. I say a majority of them are worth watching. Some of them have very muted horror elements, though. So when you go in, some of them are going to have stronger horror elements. Other ones, the horror elements are going to be very light. So just be prepared for that. Now, I would recommend Disc 2 to start, and then maybe Disc 3, and then Disc 1. So if you start with Disc 2 and you like it, then move on to Disc 3. If you like that, then move on to Disc 1. That's my recommendation for this. You can watch them in any order. So now the availability of these are that they are moderately available on DVD, mostly used, but you may be able to find some new. All right. Next one here is a very popular film, very notorious film. We're starting to get into the more popular and notorious stuff. And this one is, of course, Suicide Club, also known as Suicide Circle. And this is from Japan. Now, as I said, fairly controversial film here, due mostly to the themes as well as the bloody violence that is showcased throughout. So here, a detective investigates the bizarre rise of teenager suicides that are spreading throughout the country. At the scenes of some of these suicides, rolls of human flesh are discovered that were made from the deceased. So what is causing this disturbing trend here? What do these suicides have to do with this girl group called Desert and the band named Genesis? There's these weird bands floating around playing music, and I guess that your guess is as good as mine, because this movie I don't think makes much sense at all. It really doesn't. There's definitely an aura of fake intelligence that's presented through utterly meaningless psychobabble. What I mean by that is that sometimes the characters talk in seemingly philosophical ways, but in actuality what they're saying means absolutely nothing. In addition, the theme of the film, or I should say the reasoning behind suicide itself, is not really dealt with all that much in this film, and the overall lack of depth on this main theme of the film makes the violence seem more gratuitous than meaningful. Also, most of the scenes with that weirdo rock star Genesis are pretty annoying, if I must say. Now, with all of that said, there are some strong positives to Suicide Club that make it worth watching. The horror sequences, I think, are very good, very nice, and they're definitely the highlights here. There are some great death scenes, especially the opening train station sequence, which has gone down as an instant classic in many circles. Also, despite the fairly thin content level, there is still some interesting stuff to think about while watching this film. Now, the primary contribution, I think, is that the storyline mocks commercialism and pop culture by making the act of suicide the next fad. I find this underlying subtext to be far more interesting than the primary themes of suicide that most people refer to when discussing the film. So instead of suicide itself, I really like to think of this film as a satire almost that uses suicide to make its points. Now, this film was directed by Sion Sono, who is a remarkably prolific filmmaker who nowadays makes more movies than Takashi Miike, and that's a big accomplishment, because Miike makes a lot of movies. He's also made a bunch of newer classics, horror and otherwise, such as Love Exposure from 2008, Why Don't You Play in Hell from 2013, and many others. I don't think Suicide Club is one of his best, but I do think that the positives outweigh the negatives, and if you value strong horror elements in your horror films, a few of the titles we mentioned earlier, maybe the horror elements were, I guess, ebbed and flowed. Sometimes they were strong, sometimes not. If you're in the mood for something that has some strong horror, Suicide Club is a good option, I think. Just be prepared for some flaws and some weirdness. Now, DVD availability of this is that it is widely available. The next film here is another pretty good one here, and don't get confused based on the title. That is 3 Extremes 2, also known as 3. Alright, so this is an anthology of 3 short horror films from South Korea, Thailand, and Hong Kong. Now, we have not yet covered the first 3 Extremes anthology film because though the short films that were in that anthology were actually made after the short stories that were included in 3 Extremes 2. Confusing, right? Well, the original title for this anthology was simply 3, with the sequel being 3 Extremes. But the DVD distributors in America chose to release 3 Extremes first, then subsequently released 3 as 3 Extremes 2. Yes. So, for our purposes here, 3 Extremes 2 comes before 3 Extremes, technically, due to the original release dates of the films that are included therein. So let's talk about these films that are in 3 Extremes 2. And I must say that I recently rewatched this anthology just in the past week, and I think it was actually a little bit better than what I remembered. So there's some good stuff here. Now, the South Korean short film entitled Memories comes first on the DVD and was directed by Ji-woon Kim. Now, he's a very popular director who has given us a number of great films recently, both horror and otherwise. His non-horror contributions include The Good, the Bad, the Weird, and A Bittersweet Life. Now, the official plot synopsis of Memories is as follows. Now, a man goes to a psychiatrist to try to remember what happened the day his wife disappeared from his life. Meanwhile, his wife actually wakes up and finds herself lying on a deserted road, having no idea how she got there in the first place. So she tries to find her way home. At the same time, her husband drives home to their apartment. So separately, they basically begin to regain their memories of what happened, hence the title Memories. Now, the story and character development on this short film are actually fairly thin, I think, but that barely matters because that is not this film's focus. This segment is actually my favorite of this particular anthology because it maintained a slow yet entertaining pace and contributed a very dreamy mood with some good scares along the way. Scoring and sound design in particular are very impressive and unorthodox. I also noticed a few scenes that foreshadow one of Ji-woon Kim's later horror films, which we will get to during our coverage of 2003. The lead actress here is Hee-soo Kim, who you might recognize from films such as The Red Shoes, The Thieves, and A Good Day to Have an Affair. So you got some good acting here, but again, this is one of those films that, you know, if you're one of those people that needs all your horror films to be the same, to have a certain amount of character development, a certain amount of horror scenes, etc., you may not like this one. You know, this is kind of an out-of-the-box type film. It's more of a dreamy, surrealistic type of experience, and I really liked it because I think it excelled in what it tried to do. So I like this one. So the next short film here, in 3 Extremes 2, is a Thai film called The Wheel. It goes something like this. Now, a puppet master lies dying in his bed. This is no ordinary deathbed, though. As screams and terror erupt from him. He's surrounded by ghosts which await his death. So we later find out that his death was a result of a curse brought about by the improper ownership of an ancient Thai puppet, or a series of puppets. Now, these puppets belong, of course, to their former master, and whosoever claims these puppets will suffer a horrible death. Now, I found the segment to be simply okay. You know, that's really the perfect description for this. Acting, direction, story, they're all okay. Scare tactics are a bit on the lame side, but not too bad. You know, okay. I did find the ending to be a bit confusing, though. It lost me in some spots. On the positive side, it does showcase the culture of rural Thailand quite good, but there are other better Thai horror films that also do the same thing. So, this one, The Wheel, I didn't really like it too much, but it's not terrible. Now, the final film here is called Going Home, and it's from Hong Kong. This one actually seems to be the most critically acclaimed and most well-liked of the short films on this anthology. Now, a policeman moves into an apartment complex with his little boy. They cross paths with a physician who has been tending to the body of his dead wife for years, apparently believing that she is still alive and will wake up in the near future. So this guy's a bit of a nut. Now, this short film has a nice storyline to it and is dramatically impactful. I especially enjoyed the ending to this one. In terms of scare tactics, it does a good job of shifting between two different kinds of horror, which I found interesting. You also get two popular actors in this one. Erik, who has appeared in tons of movies and has frequently played comedic roles. One exception to this is his villain role in Infernal Affairs, which obviously you have to see if you're into Asian cinema at some point. Then you have Leon Lai, who has appeared in his fair share of films as well. I particularly liked him in Heroic Duo. So both actors are solid, and Going Home is a good, solid horror drama, I guess you could call it. So, Three Extremes 2 has two short films that are definitely worth watching. One that's kind of mediocre, but it's definitely worth seeking out. And it is widely available on DVD. Alright, so it looks like we've reached the top 4 Asian horror films from 2002, which are, I think, a step above the previously mentioned movies, in my opinion. And you probably have heard of all of these, certainly. So let's get cracking here. And our next film is called Dark Water, of course, Japanese horror drama. Now, a mother and her daughter move into an apartment with a horrific history in this film by Hideo Nakata, the man who gave us Ghost Actress in the first 2 Ringu films. Now, the apartment that our protagonists move into is run down, not in the best condition, meaning that there is a nasty water stain on the ceiling. Even worse, strange events begin to occur and things go from there. So the greatest positive to this movie is how it portrays the stressful responsibilities of being a single parent. It actually reminded me of the movie Kramer vs. Kramer with Dustin Hoffman that was made decades before, which also had like this stifling feel of having to take care of your child by yourself while at the same time maintaining a consistent job and battling your spouse during a divorce process. I mean, there's a lot of stress going on there, and that it's a lot of pressure, and that supplements the horror elements very nicely in this. Performances are solid, and when the primary horror sequences occur later on, they are well executed and worth the wait. If I were to criticize one thing about Dark Water, I would say that the pacing is a bit slow in spots. When I watch this one, I tend to fidget in my seat in a few spots, so I think maybe if they could have shorted up the pacing a little bit better, maybe kept things moving maybe a little bit more briskly, I would like it even more. But in any case, this is a horror film with a heart for sure, and is a must-see because it's considered a newer classic by many people. So DVD availability on this one, as expected, is widely available. Next, we have another newer classic, and it's from Hong Kong, and it is called The Eye. So blind since the age of 2, a 20-year-old Hong Kong classical violinist undergoes an eye cornea transplant after receiving a pair of new eyes from a donor. Now, initially, she is glad to have her sense of sight restored and, unfortunately, though, becomes disturbed when she starts seeing mysterious figures that seem to foretell gruesome deaths. So the night before her discharge from the hospital, she sees like a shadowy figure, and the next day the patient is dead. So it's kind of a foreshadowing device, the ghost in this film, which is pretty neat. And there are a few unnerving, memorable horror sequences to enjoy in this one. And much of the film is driven by soft camera work and effective scoring that create a dreamy type mood to it. I really liked it. The aesthetics, for sure. The finale, I thought, was interesting too. Good finale. Now, Angelica Lee is the lead actress, and she gives a very good performance in this. Directors are the Pang brothers, both Oxide and Danny. They're twins, of course. Now, sometimes they work together and direct films, and sometimes they work separately on films. Now, based on their solo efforts, I think Oxide is the superior director. So, just a heads up there. In fact, we're going to cover some of Oxide's solo efforts that I think are probably the best that these two directors ever did, either together or separately. Now, again, like Dark Water, I do think that the eye has a few dull patches here and there. But also, like Dark Water, the eye is a must-see because it is considered a new classic by many. So we're hitting some must-sees in this video, obviously, here. If you're new to Asian horror, this video should be very helpful for you. Now, DVD availability is that it is widely available. Alright. We got 2 left. And the next one is Own The Grudge. Japanese horror film. So, move back to Japan here. Now, this is a Japanese theatrical adaptation of the original made-for-television ghost film named Ju-On the Curse, which we previously covered. And director Takashi Shimizu uses the same fragmented storytelling structure that feels like an anthology of interconnected short films. Now, the story is basically the same here, focusing on the cursed house where a brutal murder previously occurred. And the overall theme is also the same, and that a curse is born when someone dies with a deep and powerful rage. Now, an effective mood of dread is built up very quickly and is built upon as the film progresses. It just keeps, the dread keeps stacking on top of itself and kind of wears the viewer out, which I really like. It's one of the things that I really like about this franchise. These Ju-On films are basically like a no-nonsense compilation of horror sequences that are stacked just one on top of the other. I really like that. Pacing for these films is really nice, too. Now, sometimes I just don't feel like sitting through long stretches of character or storyline development. And I thankfully don't have to worry about that while watching a Ju-On film most of the time. Now, with that said, you still get a good, high-level feel for some of the personalities here of the main characters based on their interactions with others before they meet their ends. Now, horror sequences here are pronounced, sufficiently creepy, and nicely constructed. A few of the scare tactics are the traditional spooky variety, which actually has a little bit of a cheesiness to it. When I rewatched this one fairly recently, there were a few scenes that maybe a little bit on the cheesy side, but there were also some legitimately scary scenes as well, so they mix it up. And that's another thing I like about some of these Japanese horror films in general, is that sometimes they opt for like that traditional classic spookiness vibe that harks back to like classic horror cinema. So, it's another positive. I consider that to be a positive. Sometimes the cheesiness gets out of hand and it's just stupid, right? But this Ju-On the Grudge film, I don't think suffers from that. Now, one other memorable aspect of the Ju-On films is the architecture of the house itself, which not a lot of people talk about. It's a very claustrophobic setup. If you pay attention to the film while you're watching it, just every time they shoot a scene in that house, you just want to like get out of there. There's like no room to move around because all the hallways are cramped, and even the entranceway feels like a prison cell or something. The architecture of the house definitely lends a little bit to the effectiveness of the film. Now, I do prefer Ju-On the Grudge over Suicide Club, over Dark Water and The Eye. So, this one's one of my favorites of this year. And to be frank, I also prefer Ju-On the Curse and a few of the subsequent Ju-On films over some of those previously mentioned films as well. So I'm a pretty big Ju-On fan. I'm a bigger Ju-On fan than I am a Ring-U fan, actually. And in my later videos, you're going to see why. So, DVD availability of Ju-On the Grudge is that it is widely available. Alright, so we've hit my favorite Asian horror film from 2002. It's not Suicide Club. It's not Dark Water. It's not The Eye. And it's not Ju-On the Grudge. So what could it be? Do you have any idea? Could anybody guess this movie? I'm wondering. I'll give you 2 seconds. Okay. It's called Phone from South Korea. So after writing a series of articles about a scandal, a journalist receives threatening phone calls on her cellular and subsequently changes her number. But that only leads to worse matters when her best friend's little daughter answers a phone call and becomes traumatized by what she hears on the other end. Now, our protagonist here, played very nicely by Ji-won Ha, a mega popular actress, is one of the spunkier lead heroines in recent memory. Very early on, her outgoing personality is established, and she's a very likable character, and I really like the spunkiness of her. You know, she doesn't take any crap. In fact, all of the performances in this are actually very strong, too, with the most memorable actress actually being the little girl, who contributes one of the most convincingly psychotic performances in horror film history, especially for a child. This could be like the most terrifying child performance I've ever seen. This girl just, I don't know where they got this actress from, but she freaking brings it in this. She's really good. The storyline goes into some unexpected territory, too. It's well crafted and fairly complex. It's almost like the second half kind of takes some turns that you weren't quite expecting, and I like that. The horror elements are numerous and still manage to produce some highly effective, thrilling moments, especially during the latter half. I think the horror sequences early on are maybe a little bit more conventional, and the ones later on are maybe not unconventional, but definitely more effective. There's one scene involving a person and a staircase that just is very haunting and disturbing, actually. And it's not like a Own The Grudge scene with a ghost crawling down or anything. It's legitimately like real life type scary stuff. And that scene is very effective. I really like this movie, Phone, and there's just something about it where I think maybe it's like a combination of like the spunkiness of the lead protagonist and the really nicely written storyline and some of the really interesting horror sequences. It all kind of blend together. I'm really engaged with this movie from start to finish. You know what I mean? I think that's why I kind of give it a notch above some of the previously mentioned films. I remember renting this at Blockbuster Video, and when I saw it, I rolled my eyes. I mean, really? Like, I rolled my eyes and said, really? Phone? Like, they're really stooping to this? Like, they can't think of anything more, creative than a movie about a haunted phone or something? And I was just like, I gotta watch it. You know, it's when I started getting into Asian horror, and I was like, I'll watch it, whatever. And it was great. I liked this movie a lot. I mean, it's called Phone, for goodness sakes, and it was a good movie. Man. So, Phone is widely available, so definitely check this one out if you haven't already. People don't mention this as much as Dark Water and The Eye, but I think it's better than those two. I really do. Or at least more purely entertaining. So, that was 2002. Quite a few highly acclaimed films during this year that we covered. And, again, be sure to join me in my next video when we'll crack into 2003. And as always, we'll see you next time.